From the moment we stepped through the doorway, something felt wrong, too quiet, too still, and the air almost heavy, like the apartment itself was holding its breath. Bob and I had finally come back from my hometown after the birth of our son, tired but happy, thinking only about resting in our own bed. But instead of peace, we were met with the shock of our lives. The front door was unlocked. Bob shot me a worried look, and I felt my heart jump in my chest. We carefully stepped inside, afraid there might be a stranger lurking around. But the truth was far worse than an intruder. There she sat, my mother-in-law, calmly sipping tea on our couch as if the place had always belonged to her. And with the brightest smile she said, "This house is mine now, Rachel. There's no room for you. So get out." Her voice rang through the living room like a bell, cheerful but sharp enough to cut. Bob froze beside me, completely lost for words. As for me, a cold wave rolled down my back. My name is Rachel, and ever since I met Bob at a simple work gathering, nothing wild, nothing scandalous, just colleagues laughing and chatting, his mother never liked me. The very first thing she muttered when she saw me was, "A woman who attends such questionable events will never be my daughter-in-law." I smiled at her, trying to keep the peace, and gently reminded her that Bob had attended the exact same so-called questionable gathering. But she didn't care about facts. She cared about her own ideas. She had raised Bob alone for years, pouring her whole life into him, and I think a part of her never forgave me for taking him away to start our own life. That sadness turned into bitterness, and that bitterness became a habit, one she practiced on me every chance she got. She would show up at our apartment without warning, taking the train over just to ring the doorbell again and again until I was forced to answer. Because I worked from home most days while Bob had to be out at his job, she knew I couldn't pretend to be gone. Every time she came, she walked through the place as if she were inspecting a student dorm, pointing out dishes, clothes, dust, anything she could focus on. She had a favorite line she used almost like a catchphrase: "Poor Bob, to have such a wife." I should have taught him to expect better from women, and still, Bob loved me completely. That alone drove her crazy. I usually liked older, well-dressed men, but Bob, 3 years younger, won me over with his kindness and persistence. So when his mother tried to tear us apart with her comments, Bob always stepped in. The moment I told him what she said during her surprise visits, he would call her and say, "Mom, stop coming without warning. Rachel works. She's not sitting around." But no matter how many times he warned her, she kept coming. And when she realized I told Bob everything she said, she snapped at me, accusing me of turning her own son against her. Before my pregnancy, I had already gotten used to her random visits and the constant nagging about chores. I stopped arguing back. I barely looked away from my computer when she complained and simply mumbled, "I'm sorry. I'll do it next time." Deep down, I almost pitied her. She seemed determined to make a villain out of me just to feel important. Bob and I shared the housework, and I thought of her complaints as nothing more than background noise. But the day I told her I was pregnant, her cruelty went too far. Instead of being happy, she narrowed her eyes and asked, "You're pregnant? Whose child?" "Is it Bob's?" Bob and I had hugged each other in pure joy when we found out, his hands gently stroking my belly, whispering how excited he was to meet our baby. Yet somehow his mother looked at me as if I had committed a crime. When I simply stared at her, confused, she doubled down, claiming, "You must have betrayed Bob. You're older and plain. A woman like you and Bob couldn't possibly have a child." Her words lit a fire inside me. I finally snapped and shouted, "That's impossible. Please go home." She smirked, thrilled to have made me angry, and left saying, "I knew I was right. I'll tell Bob everything." She probably did, but Bob never believed her. He shut her accusations down in seconds, saying, "That's impossible. Rachel would never hurt me." His faith in me melted my heart every time. Months later, when I went back to my childhood home to prepare for the birth, he visited whenever he could. "I miss you when you're not home, Rachel," he would say, even though he understood how much I enjoyed being with my parents. The day labor started, he rushed over from work the moment he heard. He held my hand through the pain, tears gathering in his eyes, whispering, "I wish I could take your place." In my agony I snapped, "Then do it." But he laughed weakly and said, "Sorry, Rachel, I can't." Still, he stayed by me the whole time until our baby boy finally arrived. The moment they placed tiny Jacob in my arms, warmth filled me from head to toe. I cried without shame, and Bob cried with me, thanking me over and over for giving birth to our son. We spent peaceful days at my parents' home, learning to care for Jacob, adjusting to a life that felt soft and new, but returning to our apartment destroyed that peace in seconds. The unlocked door, the strange silence, and then my mother-in-law, sitting there as if she paid the rent, sipping tea like a queen in her palace. Bob and I stared at her. "Did you give your mom a key?" I whispered. He shook his head quickly. She overheard and proudly placed a key on the table. "I saw your key hanging near the entrance," she said, "so I borrowed it and made a copy." My legs nearly gave out. She had actually stolen our house key. Her eyes then drifted toward Jacob in Bob's arms. She studied him, then turned to Bob with a twisted smile. "Isn't that Rachel's baby with some unknown man? Bob, put him down. You don't have to deal with her problems. Come home with me." "And you," she glared at me, "are you still claiming this baby is Bob's? If you want to do a DNA test, fine. But look at him. He's ugly like you. He looks nothing like my handsome Bob." Her words hung in the air like poison. Bob stared at her, fury rising behind his eyes. She froze when she saw his expression. "Mom," Bob said, voice hard as stone, "I've told you not to come here without permission, and not to speak badly about Rachel. And now you've made a copy of our key? What are you thinking?" She tried to defend herself. "I was only trying to protect you," but Bob cut her off. "This is not protecting me. You're only causing trouble. Rachel is beautiful. And Jacob is adorable. Don't insult my family. My family is supposed to be me," she said weakly. Bob shook his head. "My family is Rachel and Jacob." She stared at him, trembling. And while she stood frozen, I calmly gathered our valuables. "Let's go somewhere else, Bob. Your mom seems to think this place belongs to her," I said. "Where are you going?" she demanded in a shrill voice. "That's none of your business," I replied cheerfully. "You told me there's no place for me here, and I have work to do. So we're leaving. Goodbye." We walked out of the apartment, Jacob held close in Bob's arms. As we reached the elevator, Bob asked, "What should we do?" "Change the locks," he suggested, but the thought of living anywhere she could appear anytime made my stomach twist. "No," I said. "Let's move. We'll sell the house for now. Maybe we can rent a weekly place." He agreed without hesitation. And just like that, Bob and I temporarily moved into a weekly apartment, ready to start anew during that time. Bob and I rented an apartment in a new condominium, marking the beginning of our move out of the house my mother-in-law insisted was hers. Genuinely seemed to believe she had a claim to the room in the tour residence where we used to live, and showed a confused expression when I left movers and exclaiming, "What's going on? This room you might think is your mother-in-law, but it's a house that Bob and I bought. The ownership of this house is Bob's, so you don't have any legal claim," I explained firmly. As I held Jacob serving Bob, giving brisk instructions to the movers, my mother-in-law's face turned pale upon hearing this revelation, as she could have just returned to her original house. I wondered why she was so panicked. However, she answered unspoken question with her next words, "I have nowhere else to live but this house. I've already terminated the contract for me previous apartment." She confessed. I was surprised to learn that the apartment where my mother-in-law lived was a rental and she had terminated the contract to live in this room. Bob, who had been listening to the conversation from a distance, was also taken aback. My mother-in-law then begged Bob and Mezzying, "Please let me live in the house." However, Bob didn't allow it. As a final act of filial piety, he gave her a little money and told her, "You should be able to get back on your feet if you ran a room with this money." Still unable to bear the fact that she was being abandoned by her beloved son, my mother-in-law clung to Bob, crying, "Where will you live, Bob? I'm lonely. Please live with me." But there was no way Bob would agree to that. "I've told you over and over again to stop belying Rachel, but you didn't stop. Mommy, appreciate that you raised me, but I wanted you to be happy that I've become independent and have a family. You really do much on me, Mom. I think it's better for both of us if we never see each other again." With that, Bob made his stance clear, bringing an end to the emotional ordeal. At Bob's resolute words, my mother-in-law collapsed in tears. Protesting no way, however, Bob's determination remained steadfast. Since I hadn't shared the address of our new apartment with her, my mother-in-law could no longer come uninvited. The thought of not having to see her anymore brought immense relief. In the night we completed the move, when mother-in-law, who seemed to have calmed down, called Bob and me numerous times to see taking care of Jacob. I hadn't paid attention to my smartphone and was startled to see the large number of missed calls late at night. I quickly decided to reject her calls as her unlistened. Bob couldn't completely abandon his mem and took her calls for a while. However, each time Bob answered the phone, she began to spew insults about me. She even accused Bob of being brainwashed by me. Bob, usually kind and patient, seemed to be at his wits' end with the incessant ringing of the phone at all hours of the day and night. Mom, I've tried not to abandon you because you were me mother and you raised me with care, but I'm at my limit, Bob finally confessed, his voice heavy with emotion. Despite my repeated warnings, my mother-in-law wouldn't stop bad-mouthing Rachel, and I didn't think she would ever change. Mom, I won't answer the phone anymore, but I hope you can forgive me. Bob expressed, his voice heavy with guilt for having to sever ties with his own mother. It was clear he couldn't bear to hear his wife being disparaged every day. Receiving the declaration of severance, my mother-in-law was in tears on the other end of the phone. However, Bob firmly cut off all ties with her, despite Bob, the landlord, telling her to vacate within a week. My mother-in-law refused and continued to occupy the empty room. Confused by her refusal to leave, we consulted a lawyer. When we convinced of the lawyer that we might sue her, it seemed she finally left the house. Weren't sure what kind of life my mother-in-law had been leading since then, but she had been receiving financial support from Bob. Now that it was gone, she must be living a financially strained life. On the other hand, Bob, Jacob, and I were living peacefully in our newly purchased home. We were relieved when a new tenant quickly bought the room in the tour residence that we had decided to give up. Bob took paternity leave, easing the burden of raising our child single-handedly. You're always working, saw heard, so I'll pick up the slack with the house chores during my paternity leave, Bob said, taking the lead in household tasks. Honestly, Bob is such a wonderful husband that I feel he's too good for me. Even when we had to deal with taking over my mother-in-law's house, I'm truly grateful to Bob, who stood with me throughout that ordeal. Recently, Jacob has learned to crawl and has been exploring the house. I spend my days smiling as I watch him with Bob, feeling grateful for the peaceful life we share.